Russia just announced that it will be deploying nuclear missiles in Belarus, right on NATO's border, right on Poland's border. It's important to remember that just a month ago, former Russian president and current head of the Russian Security Council publicly said that Russia does not mind giving nuclear weapons to Iran too. On top of that, he has also threatened President Trump personally with Russian nuclear strikes, as if this all wasn't enough. Now that Vladimir Putin has left Russia to meet with President Trump in Alaska, pro-Russian accounts are now saying that it's Medvedev himself who has been left alone with the red button. Now, this is not actually true. Medvedev has no authority even inside Russia over Russian nuclear arsenal. But the goal of posts like this is simple. Russian accounts and Russian misinformation campaign want to spread fear in America among American citizens of a nuclear showdown. Russia knows that it cannot actually win on the battlefield, so it wants to win the hybrid warfare by cutting off Ukraine from its allies. So today I have none other than General Petraeus to explain to us what are the chances of Russia actually using nuclear weapons. Let's listen in. Today we have none other than General Petraeus. General, welcome to the channel. It's an honor to speak with you, and we'll just jump right into it. Now, I know you probably answered this multiple times since the war started, but just recently we had a former president of Russia threatening President Trump with nuclear weapons, and now Russia is moving some nuclear missiles to Belarus, right on NATO's border. Is this just Russia's informational warfare, or do you think there's any chance Russia will use nukes?
I think it's just Russia rattling the nuclear saber again, as they have repeatedly since 2022 in response to actions that the U.S. and others of Ukraine's partners have taken. Of course, President Trump also ordered some kind of heightened nuclear alert to position submarines in a better position, whatever that means, because, of course, they can range Russia from the entire world. But I think, again, this is posturing. And there's posturing going on the battlefield as well. Russia's trying to eke out additional gains on the battlefield. They've been achieving incremental gains at very, very high cost. They've already lost over 1 million soldiers killed and wounded in this particular phase of this war since 2022. And 500,000 of them were so badly wounded or killed that they could not return to the front lines. These are hard to comprehend for someone who commanded 2 wars and wrote letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers just about every night of all the commands I had in the war zones. Yet they continue on the battlefield to press. And right now you can sense that they're trying to achieve some additional gains just before the meeting on Friday in Alaska, perhaps to improve their bargaining position.
That makes sense. Now, I also checked out your book. It's a great book. I would recommend our audience to check it out. We'll put a link in the description. Now, you had an interesting quote in your book. Dynamite in the hand of a child is not more dangerous than strong policy weakly carried out. Now, I don't know if you would want to answer this, but do you think it's problematic that President Trump has been giving Russia deadlines? But in my opinion, at least, he hasn't been following through with the ultimatum he actually sets out. Now, before we get into General's answer, just a quick request for everyone still watching. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe button down below. This helps us in the algorithm so this podcast gets more views, which makes it possible for us to get guests like General Petraeus. Now, let's get into his answer.
Well, I think that's going to be one of the big questions after this summit. Most recently, he has threatened, his words, severe consequences if Russia does not embark on a path to a ceasefire. And if Putin does not do that, if he doesn't agree to a subsequent meeting and so forth and show a degree of seriousness, I think that the president will, in fact, carry through with his threats on additional sanctions, additional assistance for Ukraine, encourage the European leaders to seize the 300 billion in Russian reserves that have been sitting in their country's banks, and put them to better use, i.e. give it to Ukraine, maybe over 25 billion a month or something like that. But again, to continue to make life more difficult for Russia, not just on the battlefield, where we should do so much to help Ukraine just at least stop the Russians on the battlefield, if not actually roll them back. but also economically and financially. And Russia is showing the signs now of the effects of sanctions, of not selling as much oil as in the past, or selling it at reduced rates, which was the deal worked out by the previous U.S. administration to make sure that oil prices at home didn't jump dramatically if you took the somewhere 6, 7, 8 million barrels per day that Russia pumps into the global markets. And this is, of course, also causing strain in the U.S.-India relationship, because India was one of the countries buying millions of barrels of Russian crude oil a day at reduced prices. That was agreed with the United States, and that no longer apparently is approved by those in the White House.
That makes sense. Now, you did kind of answer already how you think the meeting will go, but if let's say Putin agrees to meet with Zelensky, do you see that as a positive sign, or do you see that as, oh, Putin's likely just trying to delay stopping the fight on the front lines for as long as possible?
It's probably the latter, but again, if you could change the dynamics on the battlefield, and it's a big if, but in other words, if we were able to provide so much more to Ukraine, not just the US, but the European countries and other Western supporters, keep in mind that a number of our other partners around the world also don't want to see Putin rewarded for this blatant, unprovoked, brutal invasion of a neighbor that he believes doesn't have a right to exist. That cannot be allowed again to continue. And so the assistance provided to enable Ukraine to stop the Russians, that would be very, very important, and a real change in the dynamic in a war where, again, Russia has taken such extraordinary casualties for the incremental gains that they have achieved. Keep in mind that what Putin most wants, so he has three objectives, really. First is actually to replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. The second is to demilitarize Ukraine in the wake of any kind of ceasefire. And the third is he also wants more land than his forces have been able to achieve, particularly in the area so-called Donbass, the southeastern part of the country, Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, but especially in what's called the fortress belt of Donetsk, which the Russians haven't even really approached yet. But it's 4 or 5 major cities, metropolitan areas that are very, very heavily defended, substantial defensive fortifications in the urban areas and actually around them as well. And they cannot give that up. If they give that up, then the road is really open in many respects for the Russians to go to Kharkiv, the second largest city, from inside Ukraine rather than from crossing the border from Russia.
For sure. And I know you've probably talked about this multiple times, but I'm sure you noticed, especially here in the United States, there are a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle that argue that why are we spending so much money on Ukraine? Why are we protecting Ukraine? And in your book, you talk about something interesting where you reference some book from, I think, Chinese commanders, where they talked about how they want to use this hybrid warfare which includes trade, informational warfare, to weaken the United States. And then you say the best way US can fight against hybrid warfare is by just being involved in all parts of the world, making sure we help our allies.
Well,
Could you explain a little bit?
intelligently. Yeah, and not looking for new fights, not looking for windmills with which to tilt and so forth, but actually to help those that we should be helping. In Ukraine, you have, yes, it's an imperfect democracy, an imperfect judicial system, an imperfect market economy, but they actually do value, they cherish the same principles and values for which we have fought for nearly 250 years now. And so helping them in their hour of need is crucially important. Again, ensuring that Russia cannot achieve through force of arms what they couldn't achieve in other manners, that they cannot be rewarded for this first invasion of a sovereign country on the European continent since the end of World War II. And if you don't do that, I argue, and Andrew Roberts, my co-author, and many others argue, you undermine deterrence in other parts of the world. Keep in mind that deterrence is it's a product of the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and of your willingness to use them on the other. And if you don't help, again, Ukraine, if you don't help, say, Israel, our allies and partners in the Mideast against Iran. That undermines deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, because if you're not going to help your partners and friends there, it casts doubt about whether you might help, again, our allies, partners, and others that might be threatened in the Indo-Pacific. I was actually in the office of the Singaporean Prime Minister Lee, when the red line in Syria over chemical weapons use was crossed by the Bashar al-Assad regime, and the US did not respond in the way that we had threatened we would. And the Prime Minister rightly said, in my view, General, that has repercussions out in the South China Sea. That has implications far beyond just what took place in the Middle East. Far beyond that region, it has implications out here in the Indo-Pacific.
And for sure, we'll talk actually about Taiwan and the island chains deterrence that U.S. has been building up in just a second, because that was definitely an interesting region, I guess, to say the least. But let's talk a little bit more about the future. Now, with Ukraine, we have had a lot of deals, right? We have the Budapest Memorandum. Then there have been a lot of ceasefires between Ukraine and Russia.
And of course, the Budapest Memorandum was signed by Russia, the US, and the UK, as I recall, and Ukraine. And it guaranteed Ukraine's security if Ukraine gave up the nuclear weapons that it had on its territory when the USSR collapsed. They gave up those nuclear weapons. We did not honor our end of that bargain.
For sure. And would you compare that a little bit to the same thing that happened in Syria, where we didn't respond to red lines? We're not honoring commitments we have made, I guess the previous administration has made. Would Ukraine trust? What kind of security guarantees would Ukraine trust moving forward if we do want to achieve long-term peace?
Well, this is one of the thorniest issues of this whole situation, because you'll recall the European leaders, in response to President Trump pushing them very hard to spend more on their own defenses, to spend more on helping Ukraine, and to shoulder much more of the burden on Ukraine. And that's absolutely right. I think President Trump did achieve something in that regard that no other president, and I watched many of them, very, very angry with their European counterparts. I had NATO jobs as a 1, 3, and 4-star general, while I was also dual-hatted as a U.S. commander. So I spent a fair amount of time at NATO in the defense ministerials and so forth. And our defense ministers, our presidents repeatedly went after the Europeans for not achieving the 2% of GDP on defense that they had agreed to spend at the Wales summit well over a decade ago. This now is going to happen. In fact, now it's going to be 3.5% of GDP on defense, on actual defense expenditures, and then another 1.5% on infrastructure spending that supports the operationalization of the new NATO Supreme Allied Commander's defensive concept, because you literally have to move much further east from where the forces were back in the days of the Cold War, needless to say. So he has achieved something very significant there. That is great. But when the Prime Minister of the UK and the President of France got together with other coalition of the willing, the important NATO countries in Europe, they really never came up with what could be seen as a rock solid security guarantee. In my view, in fact, the only way you would have a rock solid guarantee would be if they put their forces with Ukrainian forces on the ground, on the front lines, so that if Russia breaks the ceasefire and commences additional offensive operations in Ukraine, that they will be engaged in that. They'll shed blood as well, and then you can see how they would then have to respond. That's just not realistic, though. The U.S. does have the ability, with its long-range fires and other capabilities, and you just saw that demonstrated, of course, in the extraordinary attack on the Iranian nuclear program. That really was the final element of that 12-day war prosecuted by Israel, and did so much damage to the Iranian nuclear program, to its security elements, the leaders, the scientists, and so forth. So the U.S. has that capability. The question is, could we make a commitment that would be seen as rock solid, on which the Ukrainians could depend to ensure that if Russia were to violate a ceasefire, which most of us think they will do, what they want to do is improve their position on the ground. They'd like to be given these fortress cities, that territory, in return for a ceasefire. But just as with what they did after 2014, when they seized the initial parts of southeastern Ukraine and Crimea, that they would then just stock back up, retrain, re-equip, refit, and then have another go at it to see how much farther they could get.
Now, as you just mentioned, you've been part of the military command at the highest levels, and you've been part of the administration too. And I'm sure back then you've had interesting encounters with the media where you saw some report which is completely incorrect, right? Or you see some report that media shouldn't know about, but somehow they are publishing about it. But now that you're outside, and we see a lot of reports about like what's about to be talked about at the summit, we see the reports about like how the leaders are trying to figure out the ceasefire. How do you differentiate between what could be likely true and what could be like, oh, that's probably incorrect?
Well, it's difficult. Obviously, a lot of this is just sheer speculation. Some of it is more informed than others. Obviously, if there are sources inside, often there are
Yeah.
authorized leaks, if you will. People go on background or they go off the record and they guide the reporters. And that's what you're trying to divine if you're on the outside looking in as opposed to inside looking out. I will say that when I was in government, and it was nearly 40 years if you had the time in uniform and then the time as the CIA director, only one occasion did I ever go to a reporter and say, that's not correct, and you should either take it down and admit that it was challenged, or you should not run with this story. And generally, if you have a good relationship with journalists and you do go on background with them and so forth, this is what folks in Washington do. It can be sometimes maddening for the administration, sometimes even for folks in positions like I was, to see, again, leaks that we didn't authorize or that,
Yeah.
I didn't do. Because again,
Yeah.
keep in mind, they go to the president and so they say, well, let me give a call to, again, Bob Woodward and on background where they can only say, according to an unnamed senior intelligence official or something like that. That gives you a sense that is based on someone inside who actually does have some knowledge. But keep in mind that in this case, it's very, very difficult because President Trump, he, at the end of the day, he's a deal maker. He's a former real estate magnate. And he's going to work this. And you don't know, and I don't think any of his people know exactly where he's going to go. And again, he's constantly shaping and reshaping his position depending on who he's talked to and all the rest of this. And you've seen that evolve over this week, where he ultimately said there will be severe consequences if Vladimir Putin does not demonstrate a real desire for peace and ending this war. That's a big deal. The conversation that he had yesterday, this virtual summit with the European leaders and President Zelensky all together. And again, out of that came both background and on the record statements from those that participated or those who were presumably with those who participated, got a readout and so on. So, you have to be a bit savvy about consumption of media. And I think that's even more challenging now that almost anyone can be a reporter. If you have a smartphone and a website on which to load something, obviously you can enter into that business to a degree. And you've got to understand what's the point of departure for you even need to understand individual op-ed writers, the opinion writers for the different newspapers and television sites. You have to understand the inclination of the editorial boards, say of the New York Times versus the Washington Post. The latter, I've always felt, was the one that was the most spot on, or the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And again, each of them has a particular orientation, an intellectual inclination, and you just have to understand that as you are consuming what it is that they're putting out. And of course, they do it as an editorial board. Then, of course, what are about the opinion writers Some are generally to the right, some are to the left. And then on individual issues and topics, the same thing.
That makes sense. Any chance you want to share what was that instance with the journalist?
No, but it did not end well for that journalist.
That makes sense.
It's a
Now,
story
I'm not
story that
sure.
should not have run.
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure if you saw this, but Elon Musk had a lot of criticism about the F-35 program, and especially he was comparing it to how the drone warfare has changed the modern battlefield, and in that battlefield, F-35 is not, well, I think he used the word useless, which I don't know if I would agree at all, but you know this more than most people. And how would you see that? Like, you've been to Ukraine, you've followed their innovation in drones and
It's
everything.
incredible. Yeah, I've been there 6 times already just since the 2022 invasion. And the first time I was there, they were actually still part of the Soviet Union. So to watch over time, over the decades from then, and would go periodically when I was in uniform for various purposes, even when as a full colonel, when I was a brigade commander in the 82nd, because we had a Ukrainian unit with us in the U.S., they had to reciprocate and so forth. Look, I think let's not get into I think there still is a role for a very sophisticated stealth fighter with a man in the cockpit the way you have in the F-35. But that said, there is a massive role for what we need much, much more of, and that is unmanned systems of all types, under the water, on the surface of the water, in the air, on ground, in space, in cyberspace, the equivalent, even in cognitive space, another one of the domains, if you will, of hybrid warfare. So you do need much, much more in the way of unmanned systems. And what is increasingly becoming obvious is that these will no longer be all remotely piloted. Increasingly, they're going to be algorithmically piloted. So the man in the loop, literally flying, and the bulk of the drones in Ukraine still are flown by individual operators, incredibly well trained and skilled. Often first-person view for the suicide drones that are so dramatic and how they hunt these systems down, can literally take out a tank, take out an artillery piece, an infantry fighting vehicle, et cetera. They've made those untenable, actually, on the battlefield. Traditional combined arms warfare, which was what we saw for the first year and a half or so, just is no longer viable. There are other means that they have to go about this. But over time, it's going to become algorithms that are driving these systems and that have been programmed. Increasingly, the AI LLM will write the program. There will be some instructions by a human about what key activities, what key elements have to be established before the system takes a kinetic or non-kinetic action. But they're going to then carry it out themselves. And so what we do need to do, and this is very simplistic, but it conveys I think, an urgent need, is to transition some of our, what are currently very large, incredibly expensive, exquisitely capable, heavily manned, and increasingly vulnerable platforms of all types, on the sea, in the air, on ground, from those to a massive number. Keep in mind that the Ukrainians are using on some days nearly 7,000 drones in a single day. Now, they don't all blow up. Many of them come back. There are some that just go out and are performing surveillance. Others are suicide drones. Others are just unmanned ground systems going to and from the front lines. That's increasingly how they do it. It's too dangerous for human drivers to be in them, so they are actually remotely driven. There are remote control weapon systems. Again, the number of these is just extraordinary. And I did ask General Syrskyi, the overall Ukrainian commander, the last time I was there about 2 or 3 months ago, how many drones did you use yesterday of all different types? Keep in mind, there's maritime drones too. You know, the way that Russia has sunk 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet without a navy of their own is actually maritime
Yeah.
drones. That they're found by aerial drones, and then maritime drones drive into them and sink them. So he said nearly 7,000. Again, that's just a number that's hard to actually appreciate, to comprehend, but that's what's going on. And this year, to enable that kind of numbers on a daily basis, the Ukrainians are going to make 3.5 million drones of all types. Unmanned systems would be a better way to term it. We have to do much, much more to transition to that concept. And we need to start with a different concept for at least the very high-end warfare. Because again, don't get me wrong, you still need all other capabilities for different types of warfare. But for big, full-on conventional war, such as we see on the battlefields in Ukraine, and also in the skies every night into Russia and into Ukraine from Russia, for that kind of warfare, we really need to transform our forces, again, from large platforms to unmanned systems of all types. Again, underwater, surface, air, ground, space, and so on.
And again, you've been following the military changes all around the world for the longest time, right? And one argument I keep seeing people make is like, oh, the future of warfare is just going to be like machines trained with AI, fighting machines who are like running on AI, you know? How overblown is that or underblown? Like, what likelihood do you see? And do you see the importance of infantry going up, going down because of how the battlefield has changed?
Well, it depends on the type of war. If you have to conduct a counterinsurgency operation, for example, against guerrillas, against insurgents, extremists, that still is going to be quite manpower intensive. Although, even there, the riskiest tasks that used to be performed by infantry soldiers, you really want to use machines for that. And so you'll have small drones, medium-sized drones, whatever, going out ahead of these soldiers, trying to identify what it is they're about to enter. You want almost like robotic dogs that can go into tunnels. You don't want to be the point man for something in a tunnel. You want a machine to do that. You want to use unmanned systems to retrieve casualties, to bring supplies. Again, all of this. We had a huge challenge in Iraq during the surge, in particular, the early months of the surge, of suicide bombers. And the challenge was then that here you are, you're trying to secure the people. You have to be with the people. You have to talk to them. You have to engage them. You have to work with them, because once you achieve security and you have a gated community and so forth, and they're seeing the progress made and you're restoring basic services and beginning reconstruction. But all of a sudden, anybody could have a suicide vest underneath the traditional garb. So how do you deal with that? Well, in today's day and age, the same with car bombs. So we would have these big chicanes and speed bumps and huge arms and everything else to stop a car so that it could be inspected. It generally was inspected by a human. Now, over time, we got bomb dogs. We had X-ray machines. We had other technology to help us with that. But now you could do a lot of that, again, with robots of various types. And they could be the ones that validate the biometric ID card that you have issued to the individual that allows them to be inside the gated community that you have constructed, where you've cleared every house, floor, building, room, cellar, and plugged all the tunnel entrances. And gotten the bad guys out, and they cannot get back in because these walls are too high, and there's only one way in and out, and we control it. And you have to have a biometric ID card, again, to enter. Now you could use, again, robotic systems of various types, so that it's not a human who first encounters someone or a vehicle that could actually blow up.
The next question is a little bit of a personal question. You went from Pentagon to private markets, right? But I'm guessing the goal of the job is still like looking at the future of national security. So a lot of the skills are probably transferable. Experience is extremely useful. What's something that's different that you learned being in private market that you probably didn't know before?
Well, I came to an investment firm that really is the firm with the leaders, Henry Kravis and George Robertson, and originally Jerry Kohlberg as well, who actually established the private equity industry as we know it now. But we now do far, far more than that. We've grown from about 83 billion to nearly 700 billion in the time I've been at KKR. We have nearly 200 billion in private credit. We have nearly 200 billion in assets under management in an insurance company that we now own completely because we can manage their capital so much better than they could. And it was proven over years. We're in real estate, energy infrastructure, real assets. We do growth tech. We do, you name it, we are now in it. So it's much, much more than just private equity. Well, the challenge is that especially over the 12-year period that I've been at KKR, geopolitics has returned with a vengeance. And so I was brought in to establish and chair the KKR Global Institute, the first and most important task of which is to identify geopolitical risks and ensure that we can mitigate them sufficiently that they will not prevent a successful outcome. And in the event that they might prevent a successful outcome, to raise our hand and say we should not do this deal, which we've done about 6 times or so. That's a big deal because the deal team typically has spent a lot of time, money, energy, effort in doing diligence on this company. And then we say, no, you shouldn't do that deal. And we have done that. Beyond that, what's actually happened is that we have shown quite a facility for helping companies solve problems once we've actually made our investments in them. And we typically own about 130 companies at any given time. We have minority interest in another 130. And sometimes of the ones we own, they have another 120 companies of their own. For example, Axel Springer, the big media conglomerate, still headquartered in Berlin, but increasingly active in the US. When they have challenges, they can come to us if their deal team hasn't been able to resolve it, or the country team or the regional headquarters or what have you. And this has happened about 60 or so times over the past 12 years. And because of the relationships that my team members and I have with leaders around the world, again, if you commanded coalitions, one of which had 35 or 40 countries, the other had over 60, that's where we invest, those countries typically. And there still is a relationship that exists. We work this hard. I travel to over 25 countries or so every given year, some of them many more than one time. I've been in London, I think 6 times alone already this year. So that has been another very important task. And then we spend a lot of time with our major investors talking about the world in which we're all trying to invest successfully together, which has transformed so much from what could be described again back in 2013 as a world of benign globalization in which all the barriers to trade, investment, capital flows, even people and technology were being reduced. And globalization was going like this as measured by global trade to a world where globalization has become globalization, regionalization. It's a renewed great power rivalry world. And geopolitics is back with a vengeance, and all those barriers that were being reduced are now going up, some of them at a very considerable rate. And when you look at the tariffs in the previous administration, now the ones that are threatened by President Trump and are being established and so on. But it's much more than that. It's restrictions on what we can sell to the number 2 economy in the world. It's restrictions on how they can invest with us, where we can invest. And so forth. So it's a much trickier geopolitical landscape, vastly more so, and therefore geopolitical risk has become much more prominent in the diligence process. So when you ask, what am I doing? It's actually really what I did as a director of the CIA, but instead of reporting to the national security team, I'm reporting to the investment committee or the firm's leaders, and then to those companies that we own when they need assistance. And so that's not that dissimilar from what I did actually in uniform at the very high level positions, say the 3-4-star commands, or as director of the CIA. And I've always had an academic bent. You know, I did a PhD at Princeton in a combination of international relations and economics when I was an Army captain. I taught both those subjects at West Point. I've had 5 or more academic appointments since then. Right now, I'm a Kissinger Fellow at Yale, and I lead a graduate seminar in the spring semester on great power competition. And then I'm on some of our boards. I don't do any more of those. I'll be strategic advisor now. There's 3 of those. Invested in over 30 startups personally. on the speaking circuit, had the book, which thanks, was a New York Times bestseller, and was great fun, and donated all of my proceeds to veterans organizations. In any event, it's a very, very intellectually stimulating existence. And if it wasn't, frankly, I just wouldn't be doing it anymore. I mean, I'm at a point in life where most of my West Point classmates, are not traveling to 25 different countries a year, many of them more than once, shall we say.
Yeah, I can't imagine traveling to 25 countries a year, even at my age. That sounds tiring.
It
But
is, but we work it hard. We know how to be efficient, productive, and all the rest of that. So, and we've got a tremendous team.
and I don't know if you can share this. Is there like a common regions where you rejected the six deals?
Um, no, not necessarily. It tended to be in regions where we do see more geopolitical risk than in some of the other countries. But frankly, there's geopolitical risk in, again, first world countries as well. And actually, there have been problems in first world countries, some of which were really surprising, where you could not get resolution to something that we thought was very obvious. When a country actually changes the offtake agreement for the electricity produced by a solar plant that we bought with the idea that there would be this offtake agreement, and that was the thesis of the deal, and it's changed. That seems a bit unfair, and it was, but we couldn't get that resolved actually in the country itself. We finally got it resolved by going to the National Security Advisor, whom I knew from the past, and who agreed that that just wasn't right, and personally went to the leader of that country and got that an exception made.
Makes sense. Now, shifting a little bit to, I would say, one of the more interesting regions, the South China Sea, Taiwan, the Pacific. And I don't know if you saw recently, but the NATO Secretary General did say that when China is ready to invade Taiwan, they would ask Russia or tell Russia to basically attack NATO, so the Article 5 triggers. And NATO is busy in Europe, so China has a little bit of an easier time with Taiwan. Is that likely? Would Putin do something like that?
I mean, I actually am very reluctant to speculate on any of these kinds of scenarios that people conjure up, in part because I obviously had very sensitive positions in government. And even though, I left government over 12 years ago, nonetheless, I think you have to be very, very careful about that. Beyond that, because it can have actual implications. People can read more into it than you actually intend for them to. What we do know is that there is a goal to reunify with Taiwan. That's understandable in certain respects if you put yourself in the perspective of the leaders in Beijing. A number of the other issues have been resolved in recent years: the democracy movement in Hong Kong, Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, Tibet, others. And this is a major legacy objective. But this is where deterrence comes in. And we do not ever want to be needlessly provocative, also. You have to be very careful about that. But you do need to ensure that not just our elements of deterrence, but those of our allies and partners in the region and friends, that they are keenly aware that, again, deterrence is based on the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities altogether and your willingness to employ them. And you have to be very, very assiduous in improving those capabilities, really transforming them, as I have explained, again, from a small number of big, heavily manned platforms to a massive number of unmanned systems in particular. Doesn't mean you don't still have large platforms with great capabilities and all the rest of that. You're just not going to get them as close to the fight as you would have thought was possible earlier. But again, it's all of these together, and that there's no question about the willingness to employ it without, again, being ever needlessly provocative. And then over time, try to build the relationship. The most important relationship in the world is that between the US and allies and partners and China. And we have to ensure that there's constant communications. at all levels. We cannot have happen what did happen when that Chinese spy balloon floated over the United States, when the Pentagon picked up the hotline to Beijing and no one answered. You've got to have communications, especially if there's an unexpected crisis of some type. And there needs to be a floor on the relationship and guardrails and all the rest of this. And I'm hopeful that there will be a summit between President Trump and President Xi before the end of the year, probably on the margins of one of the gatherings that is held annually. So that's the approach to take. Again, I think it is, again, the most important relationship in the world. If you think of the U.S. As the guy who keeps a lot of plates spinning simultaneously in the circus, and you have help from allies and partners with a number of those plates selectively, and there are more plates in that circus tent now than ever before. These are all challenges, problems, again, wars, looming threats, ongoing issues, etc. There's one plate in that tent that is bigger than all the others put together, and that is the one that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China. So we do need to give that primacy. The previous administration used to term this the pacing threat. I think that's an accurate description. The current administration, the Undersecretary for Policy, is very much riveted on this, Bridge Colby. I do occasionally think, I have occasionally actually reminded him when he was out of government that that should absolutely be the focus. But that doesn't mean that you don't need to help Ukraine or help, again, our partners in the Middle East. In fact, if you don't help them, if you have a Syria red line that turns out not to be a red line, frankly, if you withdraw from Afghanistan when you don't need to withdraw from Afghanistan, when you hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months in combat and the cost was de minimis for an $850 billion budget, when you do that, it shows, I think that actually led Russia to believe that the U.S. would not respond as strongly as we actually did to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. So I think that did undermine deterrence in various respects, despite all of our efforts to the contrary, including a CIA director who knew him well, Ambassador Bill Burns, and had been the ambassador in Moscow, communicating to him, don't misjudge this. And they still went ahead with that invasion. And it turned out they made a colossal misjudgment of their capabilities. They overestimated their capabilities and completely underestimated the capabilities of the Ukrainian forces.
Now, we're getting close to the time. I don't want to keep you busy too long. So thank you so much for coming. Hopefully we do this again in the future.
It's great to be with you, Sam. Thanks. Really a pleasure and wonderfully stimulating. And that's what I get to do on a daily basis.